Hope Logan had always dreamed of a wedding day filled with warmth, love, and a profound sense of peace, a day where every painful memory from her past would finally feel distant and resolved. But fate, especially in Los Angeles, where secrets lurked in every corner of the Forrester and Spencer families, rarely allowed such perfection, and as she stood in the beautifully decorated venue surrounded by flowers, shimmering lights, and the emotional faces of her loved ones, she tried to ignore the subtle anxiety twisting in her stomach, the tiny intuitive whisper telling her that something was about to go terribly wrong. And unfortunately for her, that intuition had never been stronger nor more accurate than on the day she was meant to say I do. For lurking just beyond the carefully curated happiness, hidden behind a wall of floral arrangements and hushed murmurs, was a storm ready to explode. Because Sheila Carter, the woman synonymous with chaos, terror, and destruction in the lives of everyone present, was about to step forward with a truth so explosive it would end any illusion Hope ever had about stepping into her future without dragging the shadows of the past behind her. And the moment Sheila appeared at the back of the venue, with that unsettling calmness in her eyes and a strange mixture of triumph and sorrow in her expression, every guest froze, as though the air had been sucked out of the room. The music screeched to a stop, and Hope's heart seemed to fall straight through her chest as she wondered how, why, and in what world Sheila, of all people, had the audacity to appear on her wedding day. Liam stiffened instantly. Steffi gasped. Ridge moved protectively toward Brooke. Finn instinctively stepped forward as though anticipating the worst, and even Deacon, torn between shame and some inexplicable protectiveness, seemed to know that whatever Sheila was about to deliver would leave scars none of them were prepared for. And when Sheila raised her hand to silence the outraged shouts demanding she leave immediately, her voice cut through the tension like a blade as she declared she had a truth, one that directly affected Hope, one that would shatter the foundation of everything she believed about her own life, her family, and the man waiting at the altar. Hope, trembling, whispered she didn't want to hear anything from Sheila Carter, but it was already too late, because Sheila insisted this was not about manipulation, revenge, or destruction. Though no one believed her, but about a secret buried long before Hope understood the world, a secret involving her paternity, her childhood, and the very identity of the father she spent her entire life believing had shaped who she was. And before Brooke could forcefully demand security to escort Sheila away, Sheila blurted out the words that would detonate through the room like a bomb. Hope, the man you think is your father, isn't your biological father, and the collective gasp that followed could have shattered glass. As Brooke's eyes widened with horror, Deacon froze in stunned disbelief, and Hope felt as though she had stepped outside her own body, unable to breathe. Sheila, with trembling voice but unmistakable satisfaction in the devastation unfolding, continued explaining that years ago, during a time of confusion and desperation, decisions had been made, lies had been constructed, and identities had been protected, not for Hope's benefit, but to save reputations, to preserve marriages, and to keep certain powerful names from being dragged through the mud. And though Brooke repeatedly yelled for Sheila to stop, to shut up, to stop poisoning this day, Sheila pressed forward, insisting she had proof, insisting she had kept the secret for years because she was threatened, intimidated, and warned never to speak it aloud. But circumstances had changed, and she believed Hope deserved the truth before binding herself to another life based on falsehoods. Hope, trembling violently, begged someone to explain what Sheila meant, begged her mother to tell her the truth, and when Brooke's face collapsed into an expression of unbearable guilt and panic, that was when Hope knew, deep in her soul, that this wasn't one of Sheila's manipulations, that the secret being exposed was not fabricated, and that her entire identity was truly in jeopardy. And as Sheila delivered the name of the man she claimed was Hope's actual father, a name that sent shockwaves through the room, a name deeply tied to another scandal from decades past, Hope felt her legs buckle beneath her as she realized her life had been built on a lie that everyone else seemed to know except her. The gasps, the whispers, the stunned silence of the guests echoed around her like thunder, and in that moment, the pain was too overwhelming to contain. Her chest tightened until she could barely breathe. Tears flooded her eyes uncontrollably, and in one explosive moment of heartbreak, she tore off The delicate bouquet she was holding, dropped it onto the aisle, and ran. Ran past the altar, past the horrified faces of her family, past Liam calling her name, past Brooke sobbing and begging her to wait, and toward the exit with tears streaming down her face. Desperate to escape the suffocating humiliation, betrayal, and chaos erupting behind her, outside, the sky felt too bright, the world too loud, and Hope stumbled toward the parking lot, gasping for air, her entire body trembling as she tried to make sense of what she had just heard. But how could anyone make sense of being told on the most important day of their life that nothing they knew about themselves was real? And she collapsed against a railing, sobbing uncontrollably, replaying Sheila's words, Brooke's panicked expression, and the room full of shocked faces that now seemed to blur together in a nightmare she couldn't wake from. And while inside the chaos escalated, Brooke screaming at Sheila, Ridge holding her back, Liam trying to chase after Hope, Steffi, shouting that Sheila had gone too far, Finn demanding proof if any existed, and Deacon torn between wanting to comfort Hope and confronting Sheila. Hope stood outside feeling like the ground beneath her had vanished, and every choice she had made in life suddenly felt called into question. She wondered who she truly was, wondered if the moral compass she prided herself on was even hers to claim, wondered if her compassion, her patience, her values were traits she inherited from a father she never knew she had, and wondered if her entire life had been an unfolding lie orchestrated by people she trusted most. And even though Liam finally reached her, breathless and desperate to help her understand that none of this changed how he saw her, she pulled away, insisting she needed space, insisting she couldn't marry anyone, not when she didn't even know who she was anymore. And as more guests began filtering out to search for her, with cameras flashing, rumors swirling, and emotions spiraling into chaos, Hope made a decision that shocked even herself. She couldn't stay at the venue, couldn't return inside, couldn't face Brooke, couldn't listen to Deacon's explanations, couldn't endure the stares, and couldn't bear another second of standing in the shadow of Sheila's revelation. So she whispered an apology to Liam, turned around, and ran again. This time farther, faster, leaving her wedding shoes behind as she hurried down the street, desperate to disappear before anyone else tried to stop her, desperate to protect herself from further truth, and desperate to reclaim even a sliver of control over a life suddenly hijacked by secrets buried long before she had a chance to exist. And as the sun dipped behind the hills and the wedding venue descended into utter pandemonium with alliances splitting, accusations flying, and the future of multiple relationships suddenly thrown into question, one thing became painfully clear to everyone involved. Hope's breakdown and disappearance marked only the beginning of a much larger storm. Because once a truth of this magnitude is unleashed, especially one involving paternity, betrayal, and a decades-old cover-up, there is no going back, no undoing the damage, and no telling how many lives would ultimately be destroyed in the aftermath of Sheila's bombshell revelation. A revelation that would not only change Hope's future, but would ripple dangerously through the Forrester, Logan, and Spencer families for months to come. But even as Hope ran farther from the wedding venue, her breath hitching and her heart pounding as though it wanted to tear free from her chest, she couldn't stop the barrage of thoughts crashing through her mind, each one sharper and more painful than the last, because the truth Sheila had revealed wasn't something she could outrun no matter how far she went, and every step she took only amplified the echo of Sheila's voice in her head. Every repetition of that horrifying declaration making her question every memory she'd ever held onto, every bond she'd built, every moment she spent believing she understood who she was and where she came from. And the worst part was knowing that the one person she trusted most, her mother, had looked her in the eye countless times over the years and assured her she could always depend on honesty, that Brooke Logan would always put her first, always protect her, always be transparent. Yet here Hope was, trembling and alone in a world that suddenly felt unfamiliar, realizing the woman she idolized had kept the most defining truth of her life hidden behind layers of shame and secrecy. She stumbled into a quiet park several blocks away, her wedding dress heavy and torn from her desperate sprint, the lace dragging across the ground like fragile pieces of her identity trailing behind her, and she collapsed onto a bench, clutching the fabric as though it could anchor her to something real, anything real. But even the sensation of the dress felt wrong, symbolic of a moment that was supposed to represent purity, unity, and clarity, now reduced to a physical reminder of betrayal. And as the air cooled around her, her body trembling in shock, Hope's mind drifted back to childhood memories she had always cherished, the times when Brooke would stroke her hair, reassure her that she was perfect just as she was, the moments when Deacon would appear in her life with a softness that made her feel seen and loved, even when he wasn't consistent, and the moments she spent wondering whether her longing for stability came from her parents' complicated history. And suddenly, those moments all felt tainted, painted over by the knowledge that there had always been another layer beneath them, a layer hidden behind fabricated truths meant to protect reputations, but not her, never her, because if her parents had truly wanted to protect her, they would have told her the truth before her future, her marriage, and her sanity hinged on lies collapsing at the worst possible moment. She cried harder, clutching her chest as she whispered to herself that she didn't understand why this was happening, why anyone thought she deserved to suffer for mistakes she didn't make, why her life had to unravel publicly and humiliatingly when she had always tried to live with empathy, compassion, and integrity. And as she sat trembling in the solitude of the park, her sobs echoing into the quiet, she didn't realize that someone had been following at a respectful distance, torn between giving her space and protecting her in her most fragile moment. And when Liam finally stepped forward, saying her name with a quiet tenderness that cut through the chaos swirling inside her mind, Hope flinched, not from him, but from the fear that hearing anyone else's voice would drag her back into a reality she wasn't ready to face. Liam approached slowly, hands raised, palms open, as though afraid she might run again, and he gently sat at the opposite end of the bench, leaving space so she wouldn't feel cornered, explaining softly that he wasn't there to force her into anything, wasn't there to demand answers or promises, only to make sure she wasn't alone in her pain. But the moment he mentioned that everyone back at the venue was frantic with worry, Hope shook her head and whispered in a voice cracked beyond recognition that she couldn't go back there, couldn't face the crowd, couldn't look her mother in the eyes, couldn't listen to Deacon stumbling through excuses, or Brooke crying about how she didn't mean for any of this to happen, because the truth didn't change just because it hurt, and the betrayal didn't disappear just because it came from someone she loved. Liam listened silently, his expression soft but anguished, because even though his instinct was to wrap his arms around her and shield her from every painful truth, he knew that anything he said might feel like pressure. So he only told her that none of this changed who she was, not in his eyes, not in the eyes of those who truly loved her. But Hope scoffed through her tears, asking how he could possibly say that when she didn't even know who she was anymore, when she wasn't even sure whether the qualities she believed were her own had been inherited from a man who wasn't her father, and the spiraling uncertainty made her feel as though her entire personality had been uprooted. Liam gently insisted that biology didn't determine her heart, her choices, her compassion, or the person she had fought to become. But Hope shook her head harder, tears streaming uncontrollably, because even if Liam was right, it didn't erase the years stolen from her, the truth withheld from her, or the trust shattered in her heart, and she whispered that she didn't think she could marry anyone right now. Not because she didn't love Liam, but because she didn't trust herself, didn't trust her identity, didn't trust her own judgment, and couldn't vow to share a future when her past had just been rewritten in front of everyone she knew. Liam swallowed hard, visibly devastated but equally determined not to push her into a decision she wasn't ready for, and he simply nodded, telling her he understood, that he wasn't going to beg her to continue the ceremony. Not today, not under circumstances as cruel and humiliating as this, and that all he wanted in that moment was to help her breathe again. But when Hope pulled further into herself, gripping her arms as though trying to hold her body together, Liam realized she needed more than comforting words. She needed space, silence, and the opportunity to confront the truth on her own terms. Meanwhile, back at the venue, the chaos had escalated into a war as Brooke, shaking with fury and devastation, confronted Sheila with every ounce of protectiveness in her being, screaming that she had no right to expose something so sensitive in such a destructive way, accusing her of ruining Hope's life intentionally. But Sheila returned the anger with equal fire, insisting that she was not the villain this time, that she had been silenced long enough, that Brooke never had the right to bury the truth, and that Hope deserved to know who her real father was regardless of Brooke's fears. Ridge stepped between them as the yelling intensified, trying to hold Brooke back as she lunged toward Sheila. But Deacon's voice cut through the screaming when he demanded to know whether the revelation was true, whether Brooke had truly kept something so monumental from him, and from Hope, and the pained, guilty silence that followed answered the question more clearly than words ever could. Deacon staggered backward, his face drained of all color, realizing that he had been robbed not only of truth, but of years he might have spent knowing whether he was truly Hope's father. And as Finn stood off to the side, watching helplessly as his birth mother once again set off a chain reaction of destruction, he knew that even if Sheila had told the truth, her method guaranteed that she would never be forgiven, and Steffi, still trembling from shock, demanded that Sheila leave before the police were called, insisting that Hope needed peace, not further manipulation. But Sheila, ever defiant, refused to retreat quietly, stating that everything she exposed was backed by proof and that Brooke should be the one explaining herself to the world, not her. And only when security physically escorted her out did the room finally exhale a collective breath of trembling disbelief, leaving Brooke crumpled in Ridge's arms, sobbing that this wasn't how the truth was supposed to come out, but knowing full well that she had no one to blame but herself. Back at the park, Hope sat in exhausted silence, her tears finally slowing into shaky breaths, and she whispered to Liam that she didn't think she could ever forgive her mother. Not for the lie itself, but for the timing, the secrecy, and for allowing someone like Sheila to be the one to reveal it. Because that meant Brooke trusted her own reputation more than her daughter's emotional well-being. And the betrayal carved a deep wound that no apology could close quickly. Liam, still seated quietly beside her, told her softly that forgiveness wasn't something she had to think about today, nor was marriage, nor was planning her next step, that all she needed right now was a safe place to land, a place without judgment, pressure, or panic, and he offered to take her anywhere she wanted, even if the destination was simply home. But Hope shook her head, whispering that she wasn't ready to face home, wasn't ready to confront Brooke's grief, Deacon's shock, or the overwhelming eyes of the entire family, and instead she said she wanted to be alone, needed to be alone, because she felt like she was breaking into pieces and didn't want anyone watching her fall apart. Liam hesitated, torn between respecting her request and protecting her from the emotional collapse she was spiraling toward, but after a long, silent moment, he nodded with heartbreakingly gentle understanding, telling her he would give her the space she needed, but that he wasn't going far, that he would always be a phone call away, and that no matter how shattered she felt, she wasn't walking through this alone unless she chose to. When Liam finally stood and slowly walked back toward the venue, glancing over his shoulder with deep concern, Hope remained on the bench, staring blankly at the horizon as the weight of the truth continued to suffocate her. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the layers of pain, anger, and betrayal, she felt the dangerous beginning of something new, a determination, a cold, fragile resolve to uncover every piece of truth that had been kept from her, to confront the past head-on, and to rebuild herself from the wreckage, not for anyone else, but for her own survival, because if her life was going to be rewritten, she would be the one holding the pen this time, not Brooke, not Deacon, and certainly not Sheila.